Hey everyone, my name is Nichiporchik. I'm the CEO of tinyBuild, and I'm here to talk to you today about why we believe indie publishing as a business model is dead. And I'm not saying that indie games are dead. Indie games are actually in their best years right now, especially with everyone staying at home and playing a lot of games and discovering new and great content. So today we're going to talk about how the indie publishing, or some other companies call it mid-size publishing or double A level publishing, essentially how these publishers need to evolve to get with the times and provide actual value to developers and to partners. So this is going to be a really quick talk about what we're seeing in the market and how we believe everyone should adapt to the ever-changing landscape of video games. So really short about tinyBuild. We were an indie developer.
I am you from the future. There's no time to explain. Follow me to— Oh, Christ!
That then turned into a publisher, and now we're a publisher/developer hybrid. We do have a few studios spread all across the world, and we work with a lot of second and third party developers also spread all around the world. Personally, I've been a game journalist, a pro gamer, and was in tinyBuild. I was a producer on a couple of titles that you may have heard of, like Hello Neighbor and Graveyard Keeper. So why is indie publishing dead? I'm going to give you a comparison with a completely different industry where I believe we can compare to. So indie publishing is essentially a Groupon style business model, which means that when most platforms, when they open up, there is a flood of content, and to provide value within that segment, you need to, provide actual value. You need to have a lot more infrastructure in place and proven examples of success. But when the floodgates open, what happened with Groupon was it's a business model that's very easy to replicate. So anyone with a little bit of money or resource can become a publisher. And what happens with the indie publishing space, when there's a lot of players involved, when there's a lot of publishers popping up, the market gets oversaturated. Now that's the bad part, but the good part about that is that there's a lot of competition popping up, and then that competition forces everyone to evolve, and that's what we're talking about. So this talk is about how indie publishers need to evolve into something bigger than a transactional relationship. Let's first talk about the value. What kind of value does a publisher bring? Well, obviously it's funding, marketing, and production expertise. What happened in the last couple of years is that funding and marketing has become abundant. There are a lot of great agencies that can help you with marketing your game. They do a fantastic job at getting eyes on your game and helping you with market positioning, strategy, etc. Funding is also, in the last couple of years, very fortunately, has become available to many mid-sized studios. Specifically with per project investments, or from exclusives with platforms or subscriptions. All of this is popping up, and it's a really interesting transition between generations when you think about the funding possibilities you can have. Now, production expertise, though, is something that I feel is not as easy to come by. Specifically, what's happening is that we have this whole new world of up-and-coming game developers. They're really young, passionate, and they approach things very differently from a AAA standpoint, because on the other side of the market, we have a lot of ex-AAA developers going independent and making games. And this is where I think us personally do bring a lot of value, because we work with both sides. We've actually grown teams from one person when it was a solo developer, and then scaled those teams to 10, 12, and I think our biggest team right now is 27 people. So that is something that a publisher should bring to the table. Those three major things: funding, marketing, and production expertise. And I'm not going to talk about the in-depths of how to market your indie game or the funding structures behind that. What I really want to get into is that developers and publishers need to search for a partnership relationship. What we've noticed in the last few years is that when you have a transactional relationship where you sign up for a single game deal and you have this transaction of launching this game, and then the game becomes a huge success, What happens most of the time, and this actually happened with us when we launched our first game, we didn't want to make a game number 2, despite the commercial success. So, you have money coming in, and then your fans expect a game number 2 within that new brand, within that new intellectual property. And the problem lies when it is just that, a transaction. When you have a hit game and then it doesn't result in something bigger. Because what happens in an oversaturated market is you have too many products on shelves, not enough eyes on every product. So the value of a hit game is really high. So that value starts to diminish as soon as you stop making products within that IP, within that brand. And a very practical example is, sequels, DLCs, something that is going to live on years from now and be in people's minds, 5-10 years from now, with sequels, DLCs, all of that. So I strongly believe that publishers and developers, whenever you meet at events like this at the GI Summit, you need to think about more long-term and not transactional, because that's where the value lies. And really, we're really limited by time and not anything else. So you really need to spend the time with people you love working with. So if you love working with your publisher, think of it as a partnership, not necessarily a publisher-developer relationship. So again, building long-term relationship with developers has been paramount to us. That was priority number 1, and it still is. And within that partnership, we want to create IP that becomes successful and then help build the infrastructure and the expertise to make those to make the intellectual property into a brand and a franchise that's going to live for years to come. Now, this does come with a lot of caveats and practical examples. So just so it doesn't feel like fluff, I'm going to give you some very practical examples of what you should be thinking of right now. One of the things that we noticed really early on when we're doing merchandising for the Hello Neighbor game, which right now I think it just passed 30 million installs across all platforms, is we only had one key character. That was the neighbor. The recognizable character was a mustache. And that's not the way to go about it. You really need to always think about an ensemble of cast and characters that your fans will actually relate to. You need to think about that within the context of recognizability and key art, because when you have 5 or 7 recognizable characters, well, you need to have your banner character, your hero art, but you also really need to think about how do you position within the game other characters that then your fans react to and really resonate with on an emotional level, and then that opens up so many opportunities for merchandising, for branding, for cross media, for TV shows. We've actually just launched a pilot for our Hello Neighbor series, and all of those things are something that we were doing in the midst of chaos, right? When your initial product hits, we were just like, okay, we need to do this, and that. So I think a partnership with developers is really important here to prep them during production with some production experience on what kind of things to expect and what kind of things to foresee before you actually launch your game, and not doing it really in the midst of things. Also, a really important thing is your post-launch support. What is your plan there? Are you planning to do DLCs? Are you planning to do sequels? Are you planning to do spin-offs? An interesting example that happened with us was when the original Hello Neighbor game launched, it became a huge viral success. And on the development front, what we did is we actually kickstarted 2 projects at once. We kickstarted the development of a multiplayer spin-off called Secret Neighbor, which came out this past Halloween, and then the prequel, which came out a year before that. So we already had a plan in motion for consistent flow of games within the brand. A prequel a year later after the original game's launch, a multiplayer spin-off a year after that, and then I'm really excited to share within a couple of months on what we're doing this year within the brand. But the same kind of strategy applies to all new games that we are working on. We're really thinking, all right, this game is showing all of the signs of success really early on. What is our development plan? When do we actually launch the game? What kind of post-launch content can we have? And one really interesting thing that happened, especially if you're thinking about games as a service, which we'll talk about a little bit later, is your game as a service, and think about it mostly as multiplayer games, games that you need to operate. Those games require much more support and dev time after they launch than during development. And something not many studios realize is that there's going to be actually more work coming your way if your multiplayer game is successful. So now, before you do all of that, you need to make sure that you're on the same page with your partner. There are a lot of variation here. There are a lot of questions here. There's a lot of variances and variables up in the air. So like, for example, what if you have this game that you're almost done with, or you have a prototype and then you're going to develop it this year, launch it next year. It doesn't matter. What happens if the next game after that initial launch is 2 years away from within that brand? Because you want to explore a really unique idea for a sequel. Well, what I would say is, why don't you go ahead and figure out a way to partner up with another studio that either pushes your timeline forward on the sequel, or allow someone else, another studio, to take a stab at a different take, a spin-off within the brand. Because then you're building a universe. You're expanding something that can be bigger than the sum of its parts. And then someone like us would say, well, all right, well, if the game is really successful, why don't we go ahead and make a book series? And what can happen there is that when you have essentially a lore overlord within your company, the person that oversees the full brand, that person can work with the book writer that can help you make this world much more fleshed out. Flesh out the characters, flesh out the stories. And books are a medium that can be much faster than video game development. We all know how long video games take, and you might be able to take a lot of inspiration from the book that's based on your game that you then base your next game on based on the book. It's a really interesting concept that blows my mind on how different mediums can come together and actually complement each other to make your product better.
Toss a coin to your witcher.
It's amazing to see, but it's also a lot of chaos. I'm telling you, like, the amount of people we have working on brands right now and brand books, guidelines, all of that is insane. And then proofreading every single book, making sure that's all canon, that's a whole different business that we would be able to help for upcoming partners. Now, the other thing that is really interesting here is, I'm sure many of you have already developed or are working on multiplayer games. And multiplayer games, I will call them game as a service, because that's really what they are. They are something that you continue developing post-launch. What happens is that it's a very difficult thing to pull off in the transactional relationship I mentioned. What you typically do is, you launch a game and then you have like a few DLCs planned out or like some updates, and then revenue share kicks in, and then you start working on your next game. This doesn't work for multiplayer games, because people can smell if you're trying to put off working on your multiplayer game, because fans are always right, and it's not worth to argue with them. So when you stop updating your multiplayer game, you're going to see your numbers just dive. And the post-launch team will actually have more work to do than the development team. And they can be the same team, and it's not necessarily separate, but you will need to expand your multiplayer service team after the game has launched. And doing this in a partnership relationship, not necessarily with a publisher, but someone that can help you, is much more beneficial than doing it in a transactional relationship. The other thing to note here is, for multiplayer games, especially player versus player focused, it's paramount that you have a really strong understanding of how to support the game and figure out your online population. Because if no one is playing your online multiplayer game, your online multiplayer game is dead. And this is where a lot of help can come from publishers, where there is a lot of cross-promotion opportunities, there is a lot of marketing opportunities, but the main thing is to find that core audience that your fans will resonate with, and it will grow from your Discord to Steam communities to Twitter to everywhere else, to make sure that there's constantly someone playing. We've seen this time and time again when the multiplayer game launches and no one's playing it and just dies, even though it might be a great game. Another thing to consider here is, I'm just looking at how the orange is like really confusing in the camera and what to focus on. I hope it looks okay. Another thing to consider though is porting. Porting your online multiplayer game is an ongoing process, and I'm going to tell you, it's a lot of work. When you have your game live on multiple platforms, and then obviously on PC you can release much faster. On consoles, usually your game will be a little bit behind in terms of content, and managing and organizing all of that, if you're doing all of that internally without a dedicated porting producer, that's going to be a nightmare.
When is Secret Neighbor coming out on the PlayStation?
Walk out. And again, this is where a partner can help you out a lot. I did make a bold claim that indie publishing is dead, and while I do strongly believe it needs to evolve, indie games are not. That is not the case, and please don't misquote me on that. What will happen with indie publishers is that we're going to see an evolution of that, because it used to be that indie publishers were essentially the gatekeepers towards Steam and consoles, because the floodgates were closed, right? The only way you would get onto those platforms was through a publisher. Today that is not the case, so we as publishers need to innovate to find value and adapt to this ever-changing and consolidating world. Well, what I do believe is that it's smart for publishers to have in-house development, for the flexibility of helping external dev teams with their products. That can be things like optimization, things like combat design. We've seen that happen where some of our producers and designers would come in to help third-party studios with their combat design. And porting. Porting is something that is really important to have either in-house or with your partner. And most of all, you need to work with people that are on the same page as you are. Because then you work with people you love, you build long-lasting relationships that have a lot of trust behind them and a lot of past experiences that then result in something bigger. Because we're all here because we love games and we want to build something that's bigger than the sum of our parts. So let's build something together, let's build something awesome, and let's create some content that is going to become a huge brand, a huge franchise 5, 10, 20 years from now. That's what excites me, and if you guys share the same opinion, please go ahead and reach out to pitches@tinyBuild.com. We strongly believe in building franchises, and we've been working with dev teams for, well, depending on how you count, for about 9 years now. We started out in 2011 making Flash games, and here we are today about talking about how to make really great franchises. Thank you guys so much. My email is alex@tinybuild.com, or give me a shout out on Twitter. Always great to chat, and have a great GIBIZ investment summit. Thanks, guys. Did I make it into 20 minutes? Yeah, just under 20 minutes. Thanks, everyone. Bye.